Hello and welcome to Access Chat. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Jamie Shields, who's a trainer, advocate, speaker on social media and other places, ambassador for Billion Strong as well. So welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Twin.
Yes, Deborah obviously didn't get the memo, but let's strap in. It's going to be a fast ride through, a number of topics. So Jamie, tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be in this space, advocating for all of the things that you do.
Yeah, so I am from Northern Ireland, hence the really strong, messed up accent. I am registered blind, I'm autistic, I am ADHD, I collect disabilities like Pokemon cards. Apparently, the older I get, the more I acquire. But I have struggled most of my life because of inaccessibility, because of ableism, because of not accepting who I was. I hated being disabled. And fast forward to like 5 years ago, I landed a job in recruitment after struggling to gain routine employment. I then promoted quite quickly and became their accessibility and kind of their advisor, the tester, and all things to do with using a screen reader, things like that, and became a global ERG lead. Won lots of awards, don't know how, helped the company become a lot more inclusive than they were. And then I kind of was, in corporate. I love working in corporate, but I've had that itch because we know there's taking time in corporate for things to get done. So I started a side hustle, which was Disabled by Society, because that's exactly what I was being all my life. And then if that wasn't enough, I was like, let's just throw another thing in there. And I also co-founded Unlearning Ableism, which is a kind of social movement, along with a lady called Celia Harris. So Celia Henseman Harris. Just got married.
Excellent. So yeah, and I've often come across your content on LinkedIn, and it's really graphical and makes people stop and think. You used a word there that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, and that's the ableism word, right? And I think that there's a lot to unpack in the word ableism. And before we came on air, for example, Deborah was talking about it and saying it's a word, we use it, community use it, but it's a word. So Oxford English Dictionary, ableism's there. What it says is, it's, and this is the best bit, it's ableist in its language of how it describes ableism, because it talks about able-bodied people. And actually, if you think about how we want to conceptualize, social or models of disability, or the biopsychosocial model of disability, you don't talk about able-bodied people versus disabled people. You talk about people who don't have disabilities or whatever. So it's really interesting that we're using a word that is built upon ableism in itself. So language is complex.
And the definition is so wrong as well. Like every dictionary you go to, it's like the less favorable treatment of disabled people. It's like everything in disability, we have such sugar-coated, soft language around it. Like if you hear racism, you're like, I know what that is. If you hear sexism, you know what it is. You hear ableism, it's like, what is that? So it's like we don't have that same reaction because it's not defined strongly enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's it. And people are like, what's this? Oh, I don't like this. Or we see a lot of metaphor as well. Mm-hmm. Always being, when someone deploys the metaphor, you know that they've got a level of discomfort with the word disability. So obviously you're out there, you're talking, discussing stuff on social media. What do you find in terms of the reactions to the stuff you post? Is it positive? Do you get pushback?
Oh, it's a bit of everything. So it does. Like there'll be people who will argue back, but you're so woke, you're so sensitive, and I'm like, listen, if that's what you want to call me because I'm talking about something that makes you uncomfortable, you do that. But for me, I find that when we don't talk about the uncomfortable, it kind of gets buried, and then it becomes this big, massive, dramatic thing. Whereas I have always not always, after years of struggling with disability, I kind of was like, actually, talk about this uncomfortable stuff and getting comfortable doing that is actually so beneficial, because from that, we're able to ask those questions that we are afraid to ask. So I think for me, in terms of the community reach, like other disabled people, neurodivergent people, the response has been incredible. You know, like people messaging saying, I feel validated. You know, I didn't know what internalized ableism was until you start speaking about this. And it's almost like, oh my goodness, if I would have done this 10 years ago, the impact it would have had me as a person would have been phenomenal. But to see it now happening for others, I'm like, these are conversations that we need to have. And of course, then from our non-disabled peers, sometimes, as I said, you get called woke, you get called sensitive, you get called angry, or just another angry person. But they're all ableist narratives, and it's because they don't understand what ableism is. So as much as I get the pushback from it, I think it kind of motivates me, because like, haha, you just left something ableist in my post. I'm going to go do another post and learn from this and teach others why that was ableist. So it's a cycle. It's it's fun, it's educational, but for me, it's that impact. It's when that person reaches out and says, I now know what this is. Thank you. It's like I've connected to somebody in a way that I wish I would have had years ago.
Yeah, and I want to say welcome to the program, Jamie. I am a big fan. I love your work. You know I love your work, because actually I found it very interesting that one day I did a little tiny post that was just quoting something you said. I could not believe what happened to that post. Most of my posts, which I think is really good, getting about 3,000, 4,000 image. This got over 96,000. Just this one little post that I did of something you said. And it was so interesting, the conversations. And I'll be honest with you, I've been trying really hard to be the nice girl, and for years I was just trying to be nice with sugar, be nice with honey, all that blah blah blah. But then I start seeing like your work and other people's work, and when you sort of get under somebody's skin, or see something to them that annoys them, and they come back, it produces, it can, if we allow it, some really really powerful conversations. And so I was shocked that every time I talk about ableism, my channel explodes. It just explodes. And with mostly 99% of it's very positive. But then I do have some in there that want to argue with it. And I find what's interesting to me is that often they want to attack corporations in a way, to explain their point of why I don't understand ableism, or why blah blah blah. And so I do know, Jamie, that this makes corporate employers nervous, these words, especially here in the United States. I mean, it really freaks people out. And also I think people are still a little confused by the meaning of it, because ableism, well, does that, it's just interesting to watch people try to unpack it. And I just wanted to thank you for just boldly, bravely just jumping in there. And also I want to thank you for also talking about your other identities, because the intersectionality of diversity and these conversations, it is so powerful. Like you said, when we're talking about, gender issues or race issues, a lot of times we pretty much understand what you're saying, but you start talking about some of this, people do not understand. They get confused.
100%. And I can't believe I'm hearing that from Deborah, because I followed you for so long, and it's like you're like an idol to me. But for me, I don't want to sound selfish, but I didn't talk about my disability for years. And when I say I got my job 5 years ago in recruitment, that's when I learned to articulate, and when I actually started almost changing the narrative I had about myself. And it was because of people like yourselves who were changing the conversations of disability. And for me, it was like, I always say, I feel like the Little Mermaid, somebody gave me my voice. I'd lost my voice, and then somebody gave me it back, and now you can't shut me up. So I think for me, it's like I'm making up for so much lost time now, and I'm trying to keep up with everybody else. But ableism, we have such a fear for it, because we're not educated. We just don't know what it is. And we always fear the unknown, don't we?
Yeah. And Jamie, what would you define ableism as? I know that Neil already talked a little bit about the real definition, but I would love that. And then let me pass it over to Antonio, so I don't go on and on too much.
Perfect. Well, with ableism, I will say one day I will be petitioning the dictionary to change that definition because it needs brought into the 21st century. So the short-term history of ableism, it's been around since the 1970s. It was coined back then. It kind of disappeared. We spoke for this podcast the reason why people tiptoed around. But for me, ableism isn't one set thing. You can't define it as it's this, it's that. It's individual, so each individual will experience it differently. But that ableism, it is in behaviours. It's learned behaviours. It's pitying disabled people. It's putting us on pedestals because we did something amazing like tie a shoelace. It's, it's saluting us. Inaccessibility is ableist because it's already treating a disabled person differently. It's already excluding them from the offset. So it's behaviours, it's inaccessibility, it's bias, it's stereotypes, it is discrimination, it is a collective group of experiences and things that have become socially acceptable. And I think this is the problem with it. When we talk about racism, as we talked about earlier, that's a cycle of oppression that exists within society. So ableism is a cycle of oppression that exists in society against disabled people. And non-disabled people don't realise because they're not educated in school. We're not educated in school. And what happens as a result of that ableism? Yes, we get excluded, discriminated, but equally disabled people then have to manage the psychological impact of that, what comes through as internalized ableism, where we don't advocate, we don't ask for adjustments, we don't, we don't share our lived experiences, we become isolated. In my case, trigger warning, I was self-harming, I was binge drinking, I was struggling to be a person who functioned in society because I couldn't gain or retain employment. So I think that when we talk about ableism, we have to acknowledge it's not one thing. Everyone experiences it so differently because we all have different ways to cope with different ways to manage. Our mental health is so diversely our own mental health. So it impacts this. So I think to have a conversation with ableism is, if you're going to understand anything about it, is accept that even with the best intent, you probably have been ableist at some point in your life. It's the unlearning and taking that accountability is how we see that kind of societal shift. I hope that was okay. We did go a bit of a rabbit hole. That's the ADHD.
I loved it. Antonio?
No, I think one of the things that I see here is that the word is also used by people who English is not the first language. And sometimes when they search online about the definition, they might end up in the wrong definition to search. So they might believe I'm saying this or that with a certain intention, and they end up doing something that they were not really, that was not what they planned to do or talk about. So sometimes it can mislead people who the language is not English as the first language, and on the other hand, they are translations of the word to other languages who have different definitions of the English language. So it can be quite difficult to find a tune between different cultures when we talk about ableism, about what we are really talking about. Because sometimes, even if people are all expressing themselves in English on their own, they might be assuming something different. So I think we need to be mindful of that, particularly when we try to just go after and judge someone for something. We need, maybe this someone from India, this someone from Brazil. We need to have that in mind before just jumping and commenting and doing something on a harsh off.
100%. I think when you're a global citizen, we're all global citizens in this world, and I think when we look at disability through a global lens, we see so much disparity between each region. There's so much good being done in one region, and you're like, why can't you do that where I live? And there's so much good work being done, but particularly around the language of self-identity. In the UK, we wouldn't use the word, and I'm sorry if anyone doesn't like the word, we don't use the word handicap, but in other parts of the world, they still use that language, and they find it rather empowering. And we have to look at it that lens, I would say, is things get lost in translation all the time. And it's about that intent. And I say that's to everybody. Whether somebody is maliciously, when somebody's being malicious to you, you can feel that intent. So when somebody's maybe said the wrong thing or they've acted the wrong way, don't automatically go on an attack. See it as a moment to educate. Because again, if you're a disabled person and you didn't know what ableism was until later in life, or at some point in your life you had to learn, how do we expect our non-disabled peers to know it? And more importantly, how do we expect somebody whose English isn't the first language to know the origins of this word or the meanings of these words if it does get lost in translation, we're expecting everybody to know what English is. So I think that we as a community need to really get better at not just kind of becoming better global citizens, but equally having a more collective response to understanding, do you know what? Yes, it is kind of, I don't know what word I was going to say, bad word there. It's kind of crappy sometimes that we don't get the support or we don't get the acknowledgement. But do you know what? It's not everyone's intent to hurt us. People just don't know because they aren't aware.
I think, Deborah, you had a comment, but I just got one little thing I want to get in while I don't forget.
Well, why don't you go and then I'll go.
All right. So yeah, you were talking about the word handicapped, right? And I remember an interview we did years ago with one of our guests, and he said, and he's in the States. He said, actually, I quite like it. I like the golf analogy. Everybody can play golf at different skill levels on the same course. And your handicap enables you to play with people on those levels. It just acknowledges the fact that some people are able to do different things. And I thought that was a really interesting way of reframing it. And then the other thing is, yes, you're right. The word is used, particularly in France, where I've just spent the last few days. And the company I work for is headquartered there. But what's interesting is even with the use of that word, there is a reframing of it now. So instead of saying handicapped persons, they're talking about persons en situation handicapée. So even there is a reframing, and so language is evolving all of the time. I sort of see it written and have been conditioned, being in the UK, to think handicap bad word. And I think that yes, we have to open our eyes up. And one last thing, our friend Bianca Prince said that she really disliked the term persons of determination, which, we're all squirming here. But if you're in the Middle East, it's viewed very positively by the community of disabled people.
The community, right?
Or that they actually prefer persons of determination. And so, yes, it really is those cultural differences and being aware of them and not having that sort of sense of cultural imperialism, UK, USA, in terms of imposing our norms on others, I think is really important. We need to understand that. And sorry, Deborah, I did totally ride across you.
Well, but I agree, and it's interesting because it just happened to me on one of my posts. Nabil, who's done so much work in our field, and he does our newsletter. And so what he does in the newsletter, he'll also do the little introduction of the newsletter for me, and so he was using the word. He used the term the autistics. Okay. Now, the autistics is definitely not a word I would use. I would be afraid to use the autistics, but it is actually considered in the Arabic language. It is not a negative term. But my audience, I said, one girl, I think Kathy Bowers, because I've actually talked to her about it. She put a post, really, Deborah? Come on. And so I saw that. I actually saw her note before I realized that I had said the autistics. And so I looked at it, and my first impulse, being in the United States, was to correct it and to go into his work and to correct it. And then I was like, what are you doing, Deborah? His voice matters. Even if he's in the Middle East, his voice matters as much as you're American. So I'm like yelling at that. I do this stuff sometimes to myself. But so then I thought, all right, well, what we're going to have to do, we got to talk about it. We've got to talk about it. And so, because I don't want to disappoint the audience, because this audience is my community. I love it. But at the same time, we have to be strong enough to be able to have these conversations. And people of determination, that's a perfect example, because I know, so, and I don't want to speak for the UAE, but I've talked to them a lot. And what they've said was this was a terminology they came up with. But to be fair, remember there's some big days that we're talking about here, right? In all countries. So they also were moving forward to bringing the Special Olympics to the UAE at that time. They were going to do a big event. So most of the community that were making those decisions were actually community members that had intellectual disabilities, like my daughter with Down syndrome. Whether or not the people that were blind, the people that were the other neurodiverse people that are deaf, or all got together and say, no, here in the UAE, let's use this word. So that's also, to me, interesting, because we'll say, well, they choose to use it. But who is they? And so I still think we have to have these really dig into them conversations. What does it mean? How dare you? But at the same time, we got to be kind as we're walking this, because they have the right to use language that works for their own language. Like, and I'll say one more thing, James. One time Antonio said to me, which I thought totally unfair, Antonio, totally just, okay, you're right, darn it. But he said to me, I noticed, Deborah, everything that, some of the brands like Twitter, it's all based around the US, even though they're supposed to be global. It's all US. And then Musk came in and started stomping all over Twitter, X, whatever. And I saw it play out in a way that I had never seen. And I was sort of shocked. And Antonio was like, I've been telling you this, Deborah. But he's right, because so much of it is favoritism towards English, for English speaking, your first language, English speaking. So, and then once again, as I'm throwing this all at you, as identity matters, then once again, we're talking about the other intersections too. What if you identify as a man with disabilities and then a man is part of the LGBTQIA? How does that change your language? So just throwing complications at these topics, but it's what we're all dealing with.
Exactly. I think you can't have these conversations without having a conversation around intersectionality, because it impacts on how you identify, particularly with, like, when I think of words around, like the words like queer and things like that. I would have heard those as a young person and been like, oh my God, don't call me that. When I was younger, I also had, don't say the word disabled because it's terrible. I now have reclaimed both those words, and I will use the word queer. I will use the word disabled. I'm like, it's not a bad word. And again, it's all about that context. It's how we have learned around this. We hear somebody say, you shouldn't say that. Right, I'm not going to say that. But we also have lateral ableism, or I prefer to call it projected ableism, where disabled people are telling other disabled people, well, you shouldn't say this, you shouldn't say that. But we don't think of the context. And I think this is why we see so much reluctance at times, a movement in this space from companies, is because they're like, well, this doesn't seem right. This seems like if you can't get together and form an opinion, we're just going to come in and trample all over it, and you're going to eat us up. Because that's what happens. And then people eat them up and spit them out all over online. It's like, I always love what Merrill Evans said, for us, that progress over perfection. We have to look at the progress that's been made and see that, yes, it's not perfect right now, but are we ever going to get to a perfect place? Because with accessibility or inclusion, it's about continuous improvement. It's not about the end goal. It's about how do we get to a point where everybody's included, but how do we continuously improve in that? So it's, continuous improvement, and always, I think, understanding with empathy and leading with empathy, because if you're a disabled person being told by another person with disability, person with determination, whatever they're using, and this is the angle you're taking to go at somebody else who's lived their own lived experiences, and like, do we have not better things to be, advocating for than ripping each other apart for a choice of language?
Yeah,
so true.
100%. I mean, I spent quite some time doing similar things to you in terms of posting, doing posts that would hopefully make people stop and think. And one of the most popular ones that I had was one that actually said, worry less about the language people use and more about their actions. We should be judging people on their actions and their attitude, because on their intent, because as you say, you can feel the intent, even if people are using words that you're not necessarily comfortable with. If they're doing it in a well-meaning way, we shouldn't be going in there and bludgeoning them just because they have inadvertently used a word that you don't like, but that might be perfectly socially acceptable in the social context that they come from.
And yeah, I would love to throw something at you, Jamie, and that I know talked about this on air before, so apologize for repeating my stories. But one time I did a post because here in Virginia, where I live, our governor had done a new legislation that said that employers were not allowed to discriminate against women's hairstyles. And I believe it specifically said, I think it referred to Black women. I forget how they said it, but you're not allowed to discriminate against a woman because of her hairstyle. And I remember thinking, what? Wait, what are we discriminate? I mean, I was surprised. And so I said something. I posted it and I said, I'm surprised at the way we find to the creative ways that we discriminate against each other. You know, I was just really, and this this Black woman in the United States attacked me, and she said, well, that's because you just didn't, if you had taken the time, and she went after me. And I remember being discouraged that she did that, but more than anything, I hated it because we had started to have this conversation. Multiple people were engaging. She came in and said that, and it stopped. Everybody stopped talking. And that, to me, I thought was sad, because even if you don't like what somebody says, can we have a conversation so we all can learn from it? And that's one thing I've always admired about the work that you're doing, Jamie, because I can say something that you disagree with, but instead of like chopping me up into little pieces and throwing me away, maybe there's an opportunity to learn from each other here, so that, because these once again, these bad corporate brands are actually really trying to include us. They're trying to be accessible. They are trying. But I also understand people get sick of waiting. But I just wanted, how do we make sure that we don't stop the conversation dead in its track, and we still can, be able to have some conversations about this to learn from each other?
So that ties into like one of my biggest worries at the moment in this space, because as you know, the DI space, or ADI or IDE, whatever you call it, or JEDI is my personal favorite Star Wars fan. Whatever you're calling it, the space, we know that disability is part of this conversation, but it's only now started to be actually included. It's only in the past few years we've seen it actually brought to the table. People going, well, actually accessibility isn't an add-on. It's actually something that helps disabled people. So we're seeing that shift, but we're also seeing this shift towards DEI must die. And it was actually Elon Musk who did the post about it, the tweet about it, and we've seen the reaction. But it's because of people's reactions. It's because people take it to the point where if you say the wrong thing, people are afraid to say the wrong thing. So they don't want to get involved. They don't want to support these initiatives. And again, I think it really does just come back to that intent. Because for me, I will have a disagreement with somebody online, but it doesn't mean I'm going to hate this person or I'm going to shun them, I'm going to block them. Like, I'll only block somebody if they're personally attacking me and I'm like, let's stop this. But, I've had a message there, for example, yesterday. The person was like, we disagreed online. I'd love to get a call and discuss. And I'm like, listen, if I had a call with everybody I disagreed with online, I would be getting no work done. I'd be so busy. We don't need to, because I know your intent was not to have a thing. We're learning from each other. But it has come from that place of empathy at all times, because people just don't know. And I always bring this back to basics. If I think about my education, I was never taught about racism. Growing up, I was never taught about sexism. I learned those through society. I learned those through workplaces, the training they got in workplaces. Ableism, we're still not quite the way there yet, because workplaces don't educate about it. Or disability training typically comes from that risk factor. Oh, if we don't hire them, we're going to get in trouble. Or if we don't give adjustments, we're going to get in trouble. It's always the risk. Whereas when we look at disability through the ableism lens and educate through that, we're really focusing on the person. We're focusing really towards that social model. I always like to think that it's actually these barriers and these attitudes that are disabling these people, because we've seen them, back to what was said earlier, as individuals and their abilities. We wouldn't be tiptoeing around and thinking, well, we can't say this, we can't do this. So always think about the intent. Think about the intent. If you aren't sure what the person's intent is, ask them, sorry, this sounds this way to me. Did you mean this way? Or can you explain this again? Because the likelihood is they don't know just as much as you didn't know at one point. And if we're all going to jump on each other for not knowing, we'll be very busy.
Very busy.
Well, in a kind of joking a little bit and bringing some humor to this, I think we're all we all know that in some appliances that we have at home, they have a scale about the energy consumption. Okay, so that just imagine that you would apply that to disability. Okay, from A, B, C, D, E. Do you think it will be fair for us to have conversations on disability with people based on a kind of a scale of their disability as similar to the scale of energy, how energy efficient is an appliance?
I wouldn't do it that way. I know you're joking about it, but I think we should never. Companies never treat us like a thermostat, please. But it's one.
But when you play with a thermostat, you get turned on. Oh, sorry.
Right.
Oh, this has been my day. But it is, I think this is the thing about disability, and I think this is where we even advocates, because a lot of advocates don't even know what ableism is. They don't know beyond their own lived experience. I can't say I'm an expert of disability because I never will be. I'm an expert of my lived experiences of what it's like to be registered blind, but I'm not an expert of being registered blind because I don't know what every experience of that is or what that feels like. So I always say that disability is diverse, and there's no one size fits all. There's no one appearance, and you're going to get so many different answers to you. And trying to work out how to take those answers and correlate it to what you're doing. It is always, I always say, where's your market? If you're working in the UK, use the language they're using. If you're working in the US, use the language most frequent to them. If you're working in Asia, use that language. If you're an international company like the place I work full time for, you can't have a global disability policy. It doesn't work. You need to have those regional policies, which then filter in together to help you create that sense of belonging, that inclusion and stuff like that. But I think we have to, until we get to the point with disability where we have this global collective kind of understanding, we have to treat it at a regional level, and we can't be treated like a thermostat because not all of us want to be turned on. It's very cold here.
Okay, so I mean, just before we finish, I mean, I think there was also some other nuances in what Antonio was saying, because we all in certain countries there are different classifications of severity of disability, and it is that and benefits are attached to it, and job prospects, and how you're treated by society and employers, all affected by whether or not you're AAA plus energy efficient or you're down in the red E's of the energy ratings. But in all seriousness, there's also somewhat of a hierarchy of different disability types, where some disabilities seem to be treated much more seriously than others. And now a lot of that is down to the fact that some disabilities are pretty obvious. If you are a wheelchair user, it's obvious that you have certain needs. If you're blind to the point where you need a stick to navigate around, or a guide dog, it's obvious, right? People can understand it. But when you maybe you have a visual impairment, but you don't need that, you don't need glasses, it's hidden, like with many of the neurodivergent conditions. And Deborah was saying before we came on air, sometimes, and I've experienced this too, sometimes I don't feel disabled enough. Should I be commenting? Is it valid for me? But actually, yes, our experiences are valid. The barriers we face are valid, and we shouldn't necessarily face a hierarchy. So I don't know if you've got one last comment before we close.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that. Am I disabled enough? Because that's something I always ask myself: is am I disabled enough? I know you can't see me sitting down because my belly's below the camera, but I always say to people, I don't have a guide dog. I don't use a cane. I have a partner who's very great at pointing out when it's not a pet or an object. It's actually a person walking towards me who guides me. But I'm coming towards somebody. I look like a Muslim guy coming towards you. And if I'm coming towards you and I'm saying, oh, I can't see this, can you help me? It can intimidate someone because they say this big, I don't want to say strapping because I don't mean it like I'm really good looking. I mean like I'm a big guy, do you know what I mean? And I'm coming towards them.
A big, good looking guy.
I'll take that. And they look at me and they don't see the disability, but what they don't see is actually that everything around me is like a cloud of fog, and I'm walking through this cloud of fog. I'm also ADHD and autistic, and my brain is going, don't ask this person, don't ask this person. And my other part of my brain is going, actually, should we ask this person about their life story? I wonder where they're from. And, I get all these different things, but you don't see that on the surface. And we have companies that have tried to help us become more visible about our disabilities, like lanyards we wear around our neck or badges. And I think, well, that's well and good unless you're registered blind and you have no clue who's disabled. There's no way for us to know unless we're going out and feeling people's lanyards. But and that's if they're felt up. But I think for me, it is very much that's where ableism comes. Because for me, I think we get so caught up in the language side of ableism that we don't think about the actual assumptions and the beliefs. And that internalized ableism, that question of am I disabled enough, that's internalized ableism. Only, as we know, there's no handbook to being disabled. So nobody figures this out till later in life. And it's actually, do you know what? I am disabled enough because my experiences are uniquely to me. As I said, everyone, I'm only an expert in my own lived experiences. If you ask another disabled person, they'll have something completely different. And that's what I think if we're going to educate anything about ableism is let's learn that disability is diverse. Let's start as lesson 1 and explain why it means.
Amen to that. And I think that's a perfect note to say thank you to our sponsors, Amazon, and to MyClearText for keeping us captioned and on air. So thank you, Jamie. We really look forward to you joining us on social media and to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.